New Mexico Territory, August 1873. The third year of drought had left the land brittle, cracked, and ancient, like the bones of something long dead and long forgotten. The wind moved low across the prairie, not with force, but with resignation. It sighed, lifting dust just enough to remind anyone watching that nothing in this place stayed rooted for long. Everything shifted, faded, or gave up. In the midst of that hard, forsaken land, a woman was digging. Her name was Sarah Bellamy, and she was 7 months pregnant. Sweat soaked her dress, gluing it to her spine. Her hands were torn and blistered, her knuckles raw, and her belly heavy with the weight of new life. Yet she kept swinging her worn pickaxe, the wood handle splintered but familiar. Perhaps the last thing on earth she still trusted. Every swing of the tool echoed with defiance. Every impact sent a dull thud into the sun-hardened ground, and the recoil punished her bones. But she did not stop. Her breath came in short, gasping pulls. Her lips were cracked from thirst. Still she dug. Then a sound broke the rhythm of her stubborn labor. Hoofbeats. A man on horseback appeared at the edge of her land. He was older, his face lined by years and sun, the reins loose in one hand. A faint smirk danced beneath the brim of his wide-brimmed hat. "Oh, well," he said, letting out a dry chuckle. "Lady, this dirt's thirstier than hell itself." Sarah didn't answer. She didn't look at him at first. She simply gripped the axe tighter. The man's chuckle deepened. "You'll bury yourself out here before you find water." Finally, her voice broke through the heat, dry as the desert wind. "Then I'll bury myself trying, because that's the only way my child stays on the land his father died for." His smirk faded. He shifted in the saddle, but said nothing more. A moment later, he turned and rode away, leaving behind a trail of swirling dust and the woman still standing, still digging. Sarah raised the pick once more, swinging it with spite and sorrow. It struck rock. Pain flared up her arm. Her grip failed. The tool dropped. She fell forward, catching herself on bruised knees. The ground spun. Heat shimmered in the air like smoke from an unseen fire. For a moment, there was only the roar of blood in her ears and the distant cry of her body giving way. Then came footsteps, soft, steady, patient. A shadow stretched across her. Beside her hand appeared a flask, metal, dusty, its cap already loosened. She looked up slowly till he stood above her, silent and unmoving, broad-shouldered, dust-streaked, his eyes like baked earth, his jaw clenched against the wind. He said nothing. He never did, not since the war, not since he came back alone, when her husband didn't. But now there he stood, as still as a monument, offering her water with no words, no pity. Her pride faltered, but thirst won. She drank, 3 long gulps. The water was warm, metallic, but it could have been liquid gold. When she handed the flask back, her fingers trembled. "I don't need your sympathy," she said, voice cracking like old leather. Tom said nothing. He looked to the shallow pit, then to her torn hands. He turned away, but returned moments later with a second shovel. Without asking, without a word, he stepped into the hole and began to dig. Sarah stood still, breath catching. "I said I'd do it alone," she muttered. The words had no bite, no real protest. She bent, picked up her dropped pickaxe, and stepped beside him. "If you're going to be here," she said, "I set the pace." He paused long enough to meet her gaze. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes, something tired, kind, and long buried, softened. Then he kept digging. After a moment, so did she. Tom Cade had been a ghost long before Sarah saw him that day. He lived alone beyond the dry creek bed east of the Bellamy land, where even the cactus refused to grow. People whispered about him, that he hadn't spoken a word since he returned from the war, that he'd gone half wild, that he'd lost someone. Sarah knew the part that mattered. He came home with her husband's dog tags in his saddlebag. They'd left as boys together. Only one returned. He didn't come back with glory or stories or medals. He came back with silence and a wound under his ribs that would never stop aching. He hadn't come to rescue her. He never claimed to be a hero, a savior, or anything else. He simply showed up. The next morning, before the sun had breached the desert's edge, he was already there. shovel in hand. No greeting, no questions, just the scrape of steel on stubborn earth. They worked in rhythm, day after day, barely speaking. Sarah, at first, watched him cautiously when he wasn't looking. But he moved with quiet purpose, never fast, never dramatic, just steady. When her belly cramped, he adjusted the ladder so she wouldn't have to stretch. When her hands blistered again, gloves appeared, draped neatly on a fence post. He never explained anything. By the third day, she stopped flinching when he came close. By the fifth, she started leaving a second tin cup on the porch rail each evening at sundown. He would drink, nod once in her direction, and walk back across the dust. And though no promises were spoken and no pass were given, something old and painful began to shift, like water slowly rising beneath stone. She never asked him to stay. He never offered. And yet, Tom Cade returned day after day. There was no agreement, no expectation, and certainly no reward. Just his silent presence, unchanging as the sun that rose over the desert each morning. For Sarah, that kind of consistency, without reason or repayment, was more unsettling than any absence. It wasn't kindness or duty. It was something else entirely. Then, one afternoon, after hours of chipping through dense, unyielding clay, the silence between them finally broke. Sarah leaned on her shovel, shoulders heavy with sweat and ache, and looked over at Tom. The sun was falling low in the sky, casting red and gold flames across the land. "Why are you here, Tom?" she asked. Her tone was tired but sharp, cutting through the dry wind. His face, streaked with dirt, remained unreadable. "I mean it," she said again, firmer now. "You don't owe me anything. And I didn't ask for this." She let out a breath and let her shovel fall to the side, the clatter lost in the dust. "If this is about pity or guilt or some ghost between you and him," she began, frustration edging her words. But Tom moved before she could finish. He turned to face her, eyes deep and unreadable. Slowly, without saying a word, he crouched beside the half-dug well, his hand extended toward the earth. He pressed his palm flat against the broken, sun-baked soil, holding it there for a long, still moment. His gesture was quiet, deliberate, more meaningful than any sentence. Then, after a pause, he lifted his hand and tapped the ground twice with his fingertips, lightly, reverently. Sarah stared, at first confused, and then, breath catching in her throat, she understood. Something shifted in the air between them. The heat was still there. The dust still clung to their skin, but the space felt different now, weighted not by exhaustion, but by truth. And inside Sarah, something settled too. It wasn't the raw, stabbing pain that had haunted her nights and stolen her breath. It was something quieter, a grief that had shape now, a grief that could be touched, not one that screamed anymore, but one that simply sat with her in silence. She knelt and placed her own hand on the same patch of earth, right where it had been. Her fingers pressed into the dirt, and for a moment they stayed like that, motionless, sharing the weight of absence. Then she stood, wiped the tears from her eyes with the back of her wrist, and picked up her shovel again. Her voice came low but steady. "We dig." Tom stepped beside her, still silent, but his silence no longer needed interpretation. She knew now what he was saying. The desert didn't wail for the dead. It didn't cry out for the things it had lost. It kept its sorrow buried, layer upon layer, beneath heat and rock and time. Only those who stayed long enough, who dug deep enough, could ever hope to touch what had been taken. Out here, sorrow didn't disappear. It sank, and only those who dared to remember could ever bring it to the surface again. Sarah dug as the morning sun climbed higher the next day, slow and unrelenting. Her movements were steady now, no longer frantic, but focused. Pain and repetition had shaped her. Her arms carried the weight without protest. Her back no longer flinched at every bend. Her breathing had become a rhythm all its own, matched with every rise and fall of the shovel. And yet, her thoughts were far away. Not on the well, not on the fire in the sky, or the thirst cracking her lips. Her mind was with James. She remembered the moment she first saw him again. Not dressed for war, but in dust-covered boots and a clean shirt, walking up the path to her father's porch. He carried himself with the strange confidence of someone who had walked through hell and returned smiling. His face was leaner, his eyes more knowing, but his grin was still the same, crooked and full of mischief. He had kissed her hand in front of her father and asked, without shame, if she still liked wildflowers. She had laughed, flustered and amused. "Nothing grows out here," she told him. James, ever the dreamer, had just smiled. "Then we'll make it grow," he replied. And they did, on land that resisted every root and every hope. They built a home, a place stitched together by borrowed nails, patchboards, and sheer will. Sarah had never seen anyone work the way James did, not with desperation, but with belief. He believed in labor, believed in sunrises, believed in her. And when the rains failed and the crops withered, he still believed in the land, in the promise, in the future. Their first year together was difficult. The second, even harder. But it was theirs. It was real. She could still see the memories, sharp and vivid. James splitting wood in the freezing air, breath rising like smoke, dancing with her in the parlor as wind screamed against the walls. No music, just laughter, their voices bouncing off bare beams and chipped walls, the echo of joy filling what the desert tried to empty. They had argued over fence posts, made up behind the barn, laughed into the night as if time would never run out. They had fought the way people who love each other do, with honesty, even in frustration. James never raised his voice to win. Sarah never walked away to hurt. They disagreed, sure, but always returned to each other, because both believed in what they were building, even when the ground gave nothing, even when the sky stayed dry, and food had to be had to stretch across weeks. Faith, not comfort, had stitched their life together. Then came the fire. A forged spark, careless and unseen, caught the breeze just right. It leapt to the canvas roof of the town's water depot, and in moments, the air turned black with smoke. Flames rose like claws. Barrels burst. People screamed and scattered. Sarah heard the panic from home. A rider's shout carried on wind. She didn't grab shoes, didn't think. She just ran. The fabric of her dress slapping her legs, her chest tightening with each step. By the time she reached the depot, it was too late. The fire had been subdued, but the damage was irreversible. Charred beams bent inward like broken ribs. Ash hung in the air like mourning. Beneath the west wall, partially crushed by collapse, lay James, arms wrapped protectively around another man, shielding him from the falling debris. That man was Tom Cade. She hadn't seen Tom in nearly a year. He and James had returned from war together, but Tom had always remained on the edge of things, watchful, withdrawn, hard to know. Loyalty was his only language. Now he knelt beside James's body, his shirt torn and bloodied, such streaking his jaw. He didn't cry, didn't speak, but the look in his eyes was unbearable, a kind of silent devastation, the haunted stare of a man who'd lived when he believed he shouldn't have. After the funeral, Tom had vanished. No goodbye, no grave visit, just disappeared into the desert, like something ancient had called him back. Sarah, grief-stricken and carrying the child James never got to meet, believed she'd never see Tom again. But he came back, not with apologies or condolences, but with a shovel and silence, and hands that moved through soil like they remembered every broken promise it held. Now, standing at the edge of the pit, Sarah paused. She leaned into the handle of her shovel, sweat sliding down her temples. The sky was white and wide, merciless as ever. She scooped a handful of dust from the ground, let it fall between her fingers, grainy, hot, lifeless. "James," she whispered, "you were the one who believed the water would come." Behind her, metal met dirt. A quiet scrape. Tom, still digging, still steady, still silent. Maybe there would never be water. Maybe it was never really about that. Maybe the well wasn't for quenching thirst, but for proving something could still be drawn from this place. Not rain, but resilience. Not salvation, but courage. She stepped back into the hole beside him, pain still blooming in her joints, and fell once more into rhythm. Two bodies moving through dust like a prayer. Absolutely. Here's the entire section reshaped into cohesive, emotionally rich paragraphs. with vivid details and careful pacing to match the style of your ongoing story. The first man laughed. Quiet types always got something dirty running beneath. Sarah turned slowly, her eyes cold and sharp. Her voice, when it came, was harder than stone. "He hasn't laid a hand on me," she said clearly, "but he's the only man left who didn't run. And when I eat, he doesn't stare at my belly like it's a burden." She stepped forward, not raising her voice, just making sure each word landed like a hammer. "So unless you plan on taking a shovel to your own soul, I suggest you leave his name out of your filthy mouth." The laughter died in the man's throat. She left with her oil and her pride untouched. That night, for the first time, she asked Tom to stay for supper. He hesitated at the door, unsure, shoulders stiff. But she didn't wait for a reply. She simply set out a second plate and returned to stirring the beans. He sat without speaking, ate quietly, and nodded once when she passed the bread. Something subtle had shifted. In the days that followed, the changes came quietly. When the sun climbed high and baked the air, he pulled the shade without being asked. When her back ached from lifting, he chopped firewood she could no longer manage. Once, when pain surged through her lower belly and left her gasping, he knelt beside her, placed a steady palm on her hand, and gestured to her breath. "Slow down, breathe with me." She did, and it helped. Tom never intruded. He never crossed a line. His presence was steady, unspoken, and slowly it stopped feeling like a shadow. It began to feel like shelter. Their silence, once heavy, became shared. One night, Sarah woke screaming, a nightmare ripping her from sleep. James's voice had echoed through fire, her child slipping from her grasp into the dust. She sat upright in bed, shaking, breath ragged in the dark. The door creaked open softly. Tom stood there barefoot, his shirt loose, eyes calm but alert. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't touch her. He simply stepped in, walked to foot her bed, and laid a folded blanket down, still warm from where he had been sleeping on the porch. Then he turned to leave. "Tom," she whispered. He paused. "Thank you." He nodded and stepped out. She clutched the blanket to her chest, breathing in the scent of sun, sweat, and wood smoke, and slept till morning, the first full night's sleep in weeks. There was still no water in the well, but something else was growing here, something tender, something real. When the sun rose the next morning, bright and cruel as ever, Tom was already at the well. He hadn't touched his breakfast, hadn't returned her way from the porch. She found him staring down into the pit, shovel in both hands, as still as stone. When she reached his side, he pointed. The soil 5 feet down had changed. It wasn't much, just a richer shade, just damp enough to cling to the blade instead of falling like dust. She dropped to her knees and pressed her palm to the dirt. Cool, damp. Her heart stuttered. "Is it real?" she whispered. Tom didn't answer. He just started digging, faster, harder. She tried to stop him, to tell him to pace himself, but he was gone into the motion. Minutes passed, then an hour. His shirt soaked with sweat, breath ragged. She brought him water, but he waved it off. The shovel split through a deeper clay pocket, and his hand slipped. He fell to one knee, blood blooming on his fingers from a gash across his palm. "Tom!" she gasped, rushing to him. He didn't even seem to notice. She knelt, took his hand, wrapped it tightly in a clean rag, tying it with trembling fingers. Blood soaked through the cloth quickly, but he never flinched. Their hands stayed pressed together, rough, cracked, and calloused. Said, "With me?" She matched his rhythm, clung to him through every contraction. Lightning flashed behind boarded windows. Thunder rumbled like cannon fire. Her screams came in waves, ragged, rising, swallowed by the wind. But still Tom stayed, his shoulder pressed to hers. His eyes never left her face. He looked at her then, really looked. She didn't pull away. "You can't keep tearing yourself apart," she whispered. "Not for something that might never come." His lips parted, but still no words. She swallowed, her voice breaking. "I'm scared," she confessed. "Not just of the land. I'm scared of going through this alone, of screaming into an empty room when it's time, of dying before I even hold my child." He was still. Then, slowly, He reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled out a silver coin, worn smooth at the edges. She knew it at once. James's coin, the one he kept tucked in his boot for luck. "You kept it?" she asked, breath catching. He nodded once and held it out. Not forcefully, not dramatically. Just open, quiet. She stared at it, tears gathering. "This is yours," she said. He shook his head. "You don't owe me this," she whispered. "You don't owe me anything." Still, he waited. At last, she took the coin, held it in her palm. Then she turned his hand over and pressed it back into his. "You already paid," she whispered. "With every day you showed up. With every word you never said. With staying when no one else did." His fingers closed around the coin, not by reflex, but with purpose. And for the first time, something shifted in his eyes. Not just grief, not just memory. Something like peace. It began with the wind, a low growl over plains that built into a roar. It came sweeping from the north, bending fence posts and turning the sky to rust. By mid-morning, the sun vanished behind a curtain of dust. The air turned thick, bruised, electric. Tom felt it first. The horses in the corral grew restless, ears pinned, pacing in tight circles. He dropped the feed sack and turned toward the house. Inside, Sarah clung to the edge of the table, face pale, her body tense in pain. He rushed through the door just as she dropped to her knees. "Tom," she gasped, breathless. "It's too early. It's not time." He caught her before she fell completely, one arm around her back, the other bracing her shoulder. Outside, the storm hit. Wind slammed the walls. Dust crept through every crack. Grit choked the air. Fear thickened like smoke. Tom moved fast. Water to boil. Blankets gathered. A safe corner cleared near the hearth. He propped her up on pillows, braced her against the stone wall. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling only slightly. One hand found the back of her neck. The other clasped her palm. "Breathe." His eyes